You think you know who you are. But most people don't. They move through life wearing roles that were handed to them before they could even speak. Called outgoing before they knew what silence meant. Labeled reserved before anyone asked what they were protecting. What you call a personality might just be a defense mechanism that learned how to smile. Carl Jung didn't care how you looked on the outside. He cared about the fracture inside, the one between who you show and who you suppress. That fracture doesn't make noise. It drains you quietly. You function, you perform. But over time, you begin to vanish. Not physically, psychologically. This video is not here to type you as introvert or extrovert. It's here to show you the cost of living out of sync with your own nature. The mental fatigue that doesn't go away with sleep. The identity that slowly detaches from emotion, from meaning, from memory, until all that's left is performance. And if you've started to feel like your life doesn't belong to you, you're not overreacting. You're starting to wake up. In a world that rewards visibility, being extroverted often feels like a survival skill. You learn early that being loud gets attention, being fast gets praise, and being constantly available gets approval. But what if this performance isn't a sign of strength, but of disconnection? Carl Jung warned that when we direct all our energy outward, we lose contact with our own thoughts. You're not choosing how to act. You're just reacting to the noise around you. In this reaction mode, thinking becomes a luxury. Silence feels like failure. And instead of developing a sense of self, you become a reflection of other people's expectations. The more you perform, the more applause you get, but the emptier you feel. The audience loves you, but you don't even know who they're clapping for. That's not confidence. That's crisis. And it's happening silently, everywhere. Jung called this the false self. It's the mask we wear when we believe being accepted is more important than being real. For many extroverts, that mask becomes so comfortable that they forget it's even there. You act how others expect. You talk how others approve. You become a product of the environment, not a person with an inner world. And it works, for a while. You get the job. You make friends. You're always invited. But at night, when the noise stops, something feels off. You're surrounded by people, but you feel completely alone. That's not just emotional fatigue. That's the cost of abandoning your unconscious identity. You've spent so much time facing outward, you've lost the ability to turn inward. And that disconnection creates a psychological conflict you can't solve with more noise. In working-class neighborhoods, the extrovert is often seen as the one who gets things done. He's the one who knows everybody, who hustles, who talks fast, moves fast, lives fast. But that same energy, if not balanced, becomes toxic. Because when you have no time to reflect, you have no space to grow. The nervous system becomes overloaded. Anxiety kicks in, sleep suffers. You wake up tired and go to bed wired. You're moving, but not progressing. Everything becomes urgent, but nothing feels meaningful. The constant exposure to other people's opinions drowns out your own. And slowly, your true self starts to disappear. Not because you're weak, but because you've never been taught how to be still. Stillness feels like weakness in a world that celebrates noise. But without stillness, there's no clarity, only collapse. Jung believed the unconscious will always find a way to speak. If you ignore it, it doesn't go away. It just shows up in other forms. Stress, burnout, emotional numbness. The false self starts to crack, and what's underneath often scares people. That's why so many extroverts keep running. They run into conversations, into distractions, into activities. But what they're really running from is silence. Because silence forces a question they've never answered. Who am I without all of this? And the truth is, many don't know. They've built a life on being visible, but not on being real. And when that identity begins to fall apart, it feels like a crisis. But Jung would say it's not a breakdown. It's the beginning of individuation. the painful start of becoming whole. Consider a man who works in retail. He talks to hundreds of people a day. He smiles. He jokes. He knows how to read the room. But the moment he's alone, he panics. He turns on the TV, checks his phone, calls someone. Anything to avoid being alone with himself. That's not extroversion. It's dependency. A dependency on stimulus to feel alive. And it's common. In fact, it's encouraged. Society teaches us that being alone is a failure. That being quiet is strange. But Jung taught the opposite. That solitude is sacred. That silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. And until that man learns to sit in silence, to hear his own thoughts, to feel his own feelings, he'll keep mistaking exhaustion for purpose and applause for peace. The tragedy is that this pattern looks like success. People admire you. You're doing well. You're always active. But internally, you're burning out. You're juggling 1,000 roles, and none of them feel true. You're living someone else's idea of a good life. This creates inner conflict, a war between the self you show and the self you hide. And without intervention, it leads to collapse. Not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet despair, a sense of drifting, numbness, the loss of passion. Jung saw this as a signal, not to push harder, but to pause, to question, to listen, because no amount of external success will ever heal an internal disconnection. And if you're honest, you already feel it. The tension, the fatigue, the slow fading of your own voice. We often think extroverts are fearless, but it takes more courage to face yourself than it does to face a crowd. Most people avoid their inner world because it's messy, unresolved, full of shadow. Jung's idea of the shadow self is not about evil. It's about the parts of you that were ignored, rejected, or silenced. And the more extroverted your life becomes, the easier it is to keep those parts buried. But what you bury doesn't die. It waits. It shows up in your relationships, your addictions, your restlessness, and healing begins not when you talk more, but when you finally listen. Not to others, to yourself. The version of you that exists underneath the performance. And that version is tired of being ignored. That version is asking to be heard. If you feel like you're always around people but still feel isolated, this is why. You've been present for everyone except yourself. The constant talking, the endless socializing, it doesn't fill the void. It hides it. And the longer you ignore it, the louder it becomes. Jung believed true transformation doesn't come from the outer world, but from the inner. But to get there, you have to stop running. You have to be willing to feel awkward in silence, to feel uncomfortable without applause, to rebuild your identity from the inside out. It's not about becoming less extroverted. It's about becoming more conscious. And once you take that first step inward, a new kind of strength begins to form. But not everyone who seeks silence finds peace. Some find something else entirely. Something darker. Something they've spent years avoiding. Some people are proud to say, "I don't need anyone. I prefer to be alone." And sometimes that's true. But other times, that solitude is just fear in disguise. It looks like peace, but it feels like tension. It feels like holding your breath for years and calling it calm. Carl Jung explained that introversion isn't about escaping people. It's about directing your energy inward to understand yourself. But many people who identify as introverts aren't doing inner work. They're not reflecting. They're hiding. They're using isolation as a defense mechanism against life. And that illusion of control, of shutting the door and never looking back, starts to feel safe. But safety isn't always growth. Sometimes it's just another form of self-abandonment. Another way to stay small. Another way to avoid the uncomfortable task of becoming whole. People often confuse silence with healing. They think that if no one's hurting them, they must be fine. But pain doesn't stop just because the room is empty. The mind still speaks. The heart still remembers. The body still carries the tension. And in that quiet, your shadow self begins to rise. Jung described the shadow as the parts of you you've rejected. Your anger, your insecurity, your unmet needs. In isolation, these parts get louder. But if you're not ready to face them, you'll numb out. You'll build a routine that keeps you distant from others and disconnected from yourself. Wake up, eat alone, scroll, sleep. It feels controlled, but inside, there's psychological conflict, a deep split between who you are and who you're pretending to be, not to others, but to yourself. Some of the most emotionally lost people you'll ever meet are the quietest ones. Not because they're introverts, but because they've made silence a prison. They avoid connection not out of self-sufficiency, but out of fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of being seen. Fear of not knowing what to say, or worse, what might come out if they actually start speaking honestly. This is where self-alienation begins. You don't just disconnect from others, you disconnect from your own emotions. You become flat, emotionally neutral. Nothing touches you deeply anymore. Nothing feels urgent. It's not peace. It's paralysis. And slowly, you forget what it means to feel fully alive. Not because you're broken, but because you've trained yourself to survive through distance, and what was once protection becomes a trap. Jung believed that true introversion required courage. The courage to sit with uncomfortable truths, to question your thoughts, to confront your patterns. But many self-proclaimed introverts are not looking inward. They're escaping inward. They romanticize solitude, but refuse to look at what that solitude is made of. Is it space for self-discovery? Or is it a shield? A way to avoid responsibility, vulnerability, and transformation? You tell yourself you're different, that people don't understand you, that you don't fit in. And maybe that's true. But it can also be a story you use to avoid the work, the emotional labor of healing, the effort of connection, the risk of being seen as you really are. Because being alone is easier than being exposed. But easier is not the same as better. It's just quieter. Let's take a man who lives alone and says he loves his peace. He doesn't go out, doesn't call, doesn't open up. He claims he's just an introvert. But if you look closely, there's a pattern. He avoids eye contact. He avoids change. He avoids conflict. Not because he's calm, but because he's terrified. Terrified of confrontation, of vulnerability, of failure. That's not introversion. That's unhealed fear. It's a life managed by avoidance. And in that avoidance, his identity starts to dissolve. He doesn't know what he wants, doesn't know what he feels. Time passes, but nothing inside moves. That's unconscious identity loss. And it happens quietly. There's no drama, just a slow fade. Like watching your own potential disappear in real time and convincing yourself that it's fine. Because numbness is less painful than growth. The most dangerous thing about the introvert illusion is that it hides behind logic. You can explain it. You can justify it. I'm just protecting my energy. I don't need validation. People are exhausting. These sound wise, but they're often masks. Masks that cover exhaustion, loneliness, and shame. You say you don't want connection, but deep down, you crave to be seen. You crave to be understood. But the walls you built to keep pain out also keep love out. You created a life with no risk, but also no intimacy, no surprise, no joy. Jung taught that balance is key, not isolation, not dependence, but inner alignment. And you can't achieve that by staying hidden. At some point, the inner self wants out. It wants to speak. It wants to be heard. And it won't stay quiet forever. This illusion also affects your ability to grow. Because growth requires discomfort. It requires you to face your emotional blind spots. But if you've built your entire life around avoiding discomfort, you stay stuck. You might read books, watch videos, think deeply, but never apply anything. Because application means risk. It means change. And change threatens the illusion. So you stay in your cave, convincing yourself that thinking about life is the same as living it. But thinking is not transformation. Awareness without action is just mental clutter. Jung didn't want people to intellectualize their problems. He wanted them to confront them, to integrate their shadow, to become whole. And that doesn't happen in isolation. It happens through tension, through relationship, through action, even if it's just one small step forward. You may feel safer alone, but ask yourself, are you growing? Are you healing? Or are you hiding? Silence can be sacred, but it can also be sterile. Carl Jung believed that the journey inward must eventually lead outward. That individuation, the process of becoming your true self, can't happen in a vacuum. It must touch the world. So if your world has become small, tight, predictable, maybe it's time to stretch, to feel again, to risk again. Not for others, but for your own aliveness. Because if you stay hidden too long, you forget who you are. And forgetting leads to regret. But before you try to reconnect with others, there's something deeper you need to understand. What happens when the inner self and the outer world are pulling in opposite directions? Some people live like they're being pulled in two directions every single day. On the outside, they seem functional, polite, productive, maybe even successful. But on the inside, something doesn't fit. There's tension they can't explain. A quiet war between who they are and how they live. Carl Jung believed that this split, between the inner and outer self, creates deep psychological conflict. You act extroverted because your job demands it. You smile because your family expects it. But your inner world is not aligned. You feel fake, disconnected, lost. This gap between inner truth and outer behavior starts small, but over time, it creates emotional fatigue. You start waking up tired even after 8 hours of sleep. Not because your body is broken, but because your identity is collapsing under the weight of contradiction. This collapse doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes, it looks like chronic indecision, apathy, emotional numbness. You stop trusting your instincts. You second-guess every choice. You move through life with a kind of dull resistance. Nothing feels right, but you can't name why. That's what Jung described as self-alienation. When you've denied your inner voice for so long, you stop hearing it. Instead, you live through roles. You wear masks that get applause, but drain your soul. And at some point, the mask fuses with your face. You forget where the performance ends and where you begin. The false self becomes your identity, not because you chose it, but because you never stop to choose anything else. And when the inner and outer self are too far apart, the system eventually crashes, quietly, brutally. Let's say you're naturally introverted, but you've built a life that requires extroversion. You work in sales, you manage people, you network. You're always on. At first it feels like a challenge, but after a while it feels like a lie. You feel drained after every conversation. Not because you hate people, but because your energy is being forced outward against your nature. This isn't personal failure. It's structural misalignment. Your outer world is ignoring your inner compass, and that mismatch creates friction. You begin to resent your life without understanding why. You get irritated easily. You procrastinate more. You fantasize about quitting everything. Not because you're lazy, but because you're exhausted from being someone you're not. Jung saw this as a crisis of individuation, the moment when the soul demands truth. This dissonance also affects people on the other side. Imagine someone naturally extroverted, full of expression and connection, but raised in a family that values silence, obedience, and emotional restraint. From an early age, they learn to dim themselves down, to suppress their natural instincts, to internalize shame for simply being alive in the way they were designed to be. That suppression doesn't disappear. It turns inward. It becomes anxiety, depression, psychosomatic illness. The outer self becomes quiet, controlled, even disciplined. But the inner world is chaotic, screaming to be heard. That's what Jung meant when he said neurosis is often the suffering of a soul that has not found its meaning. You're not broken. You're just divided. And until that gap is closed, no amount of outer success will bring inner peace. When the inner and outer selves are in conflict, time itself begins to feel distorted. You feel like life is passing by, but you're not in it. You're watching yourself perform instead of living. Every day feels like a copy of the last. Nothing changes. Nothing moves. You smile in photos, but the light behind your eyes is gone. That's not just burnout. That's inner conflict becoming a mental collapse. And people will tell you to rest, to take a vacation. But rest won't fix a fractured identity, because it's not your schedule that's killing you. It's the role you're playing, and the longer you play it, the more distant you feel from your own soul. Jung believed that healing doesn't come from comfort. It comes from alignment. From facing the truth about what parts of your life no longer belong to you. Most people are too scared to admit that they're living a lie. Not a dramatic lie, but a slow, invisible one. They chose jobs to please their parents, lifestyles to fit in, partners to feel safe. Over time, they lose sight of what they actually want. The unconscious identity takes over. You become the reliable one, the strong one, the quiet one, even if none of those labels reflect your essence. And changing feels dangerous. Because who are you without these roles? What if you disappoint people? What if you fail? But the real danger is staying where you are. Because pretending for too long makes you forget how to be real. And when you forget that, nothing outside of you can ever satisfy you. Not money, not praise, not even love. Because it never reaches the real you. The collapse between inner and outer self often reaches a breaking point. A moment when something small triggers a deep emotional spiral. A canceled plan, a bad meeting, a casual comment, and suddenly everything inside erupts. Not because of that one thing, but because you've been suppressing everything else. That eruption is your shadow self breaking through. All the anger, all the grief, all the truth. Jung saw the shadow not as a flaw, but as a reservoir of power. But to access that power, you have to face what you've been avoiding. You have to admit what parts of your outer life are false. And that's terrifying, but also necessary, because that's the only way to become whole. And until you do, you'll keep living between two worlds. Never fully here, never fully yourself. This isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more of who you already are. But to do that, you have to close the gap between how you feel and how you live, between what you know and what you express, between your public self and your private truth. That integration is not a quick fix. It's a process, a transformation, one that demands courage, honesty, and sacrifice. But the alternative is emotional extinction. A life that looks fine on paper but feels like slow death. Jung believed that when the inner and outer world align, meaning emerges, direction becomes clear, energy returns. You stop performing and start participating. You stop faking and start feeling. But that only begins when you stop ignoring the inner split and finally decide to live as one. So now you know. Not just the labels, not just the surface, but the split that's been quietly shaping your decisions, draining your energy, and distancing you from yourself. Maybe you're not too loud. Maybe you're not too quiet. Maybe you're just misaligned. So ask yourself, What part of your life feels like a role you never chose? What would change if your thoughts weren't shaped by expectation, but by truth? What part of you has been waiting, patiently, for permission to return? This isn't a personality quiz, it's your identity. And if you felt something shift while watching this, don't let it fade. Don't scroll past it. Don't bury it. Use it. Start small. Question one habit. Change one pattern. Do one thing today that aligns with who you really are, not who you've been pretending to be. And if this video helped you see even a fraction of that truth, subscribe. Turn on the notifications, because we're not done yet. There's more to remember and more to unlearn.